back at Camp Fiver. It was one of the cabins now. And we're here for our last week of brief lecture. Try to make it short this week since we're all busy and things are coming to a close. Here we are overlooking the beautiful village of Poolville, New York. My hometown. There's a duck. And just below us here is the Sangerfield River, which flows through. All right, let's test our camera system out here on our final topic of the year, cannabis. Cannabis is actually 3 different plants. You didn't know that. You probably maybe thought it was 2, but 3 different plants. Cannabis is the genus name of these 3 plants, which can be broken down into Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis rhudensis. Rhudensis is not as common a form, typically only grown in Russia. It's not as potent and doesn't have many of the same properties as sativa or indica have. So Cannabis sativa is a species that's originally from Asia and grown primarily for its fiber at that time, from which we produce hemp rope, hemp clothing, other hemp products. It grows as a weed in the US and Canada, and that's of course where it gets its famous nickname, weed. Very easy plant to grow. Tall, lanky plant, grows up to about 15, 16, 17 feet tall, and has been hybridized to create a more potent drug variety. Cannabis indica, the second species, if you talk to some biologists, others will argue that there's really truly only one species, and indica, sativa, and rhudensis are subspecies, but we'll leave that argument to the scientists, the other scientists, the biologists. The Cannabis indica is grown primarily for psychoactive resins, cultivated in many areas of the world. It's a more compact plant, 2 to 3 feet high, and I misspoke. Cannabis ruderalis, grown primarily in Russia. Lower THC makes it far less likely to be used for recreational use. The active ingredient in all 3 cannabis varieties is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is abbreviated as THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. It's concentrated in the resins of the plant, which are found in the flowering buds, and that is what the psychoactive property is of the plant. The potency is really depending on the amount of resin that's present. Hybridization has increased potency over the past half century or so of primarily amateur and some pretty high-end amateur growing, which around 20 years ago turned into professional industrial growing. And I've had a couple of friends who've worked in the cannabis industry and worked in the laboratories testing the potency and the terpenes and all of the chemical qualities of the plant. It's a very high-end industrial process now. Traditional preparations of cannabis for psychoactive use include simply harvesting the flowering tops of the plant, the buds, and buds, not bugs. Also the oils can be collected. They, when rolled together into a ball of oily substance, it turns black. That's known as hashish, the oily substance. Hashish, simply the collected oils of the plant. And then some of the oils get on the leaves of the plant, not much. So when we're to dry and prepare the leaves and smoke those, you might get a little bit of THC, but not as much as if smoking the concentrated hashish or the flowering tops, the buds of the plant. Now, of course, more recently, edible marijuana has been a common preparation. Edibles range from chocolates to the classic brownies to gummies, very common today, jellied preparations. You can assess the quantity in milligrams of THC that you're intaking in that preparation, so many people find it convenient just to find just exactly the right dosage for them. With regards to the smokable marijuana, potency has increased pretty dramatically since, even since I wrote the notes. The notes online say that potency varies widely. Typical potency of homegrown marijuana is 2 to 8% THC, and as I mentioned, that it's the potency has increased since the 1990s, but still only about 15%. Well, I've seen some in the last decade, well, 5 years anyway, some of the industry-produced pot that is at least 25, if not 30% potent. That's significantly different potency. So obviously it takes less of the product, a lower dosage, to achieve the same effects as with the previous previously grown marijuana in previous decades, 70s, 80s, 90s. That makes a difference because it changes the way in which it's used. For example, smoking a joint back in the 70s would get you pretty high, but smoking the same joint today with the 30% strains would really go to take you over the top. So I imagine that the smoking of joints, the marijuana cigarette, is probably a fad that's going to be exiting the culture of marijuana use, perhaps replaced by the use of vaping and vape oils, now far more common and popular than it ever was in the 70s or 80s. Historically, marijuana has roots in Chinese history, as those early strains were grown in Asia. And as far back as 2737 BC, 5,000 years ago, we had mentions of marijuana use in textbooks, Chinese textbooks. It's tricky. Fun though. Off-roading here. No established trail. Alright, the system seems to be working pretty well. There's a pretty famous history also of the way in which marijuana was taken up by Muslim culture in the post-Muhammad era of the origins of Islam around 1000 AD, roughly 1,000 years ago. In North Africa at the time, there was a political and religious cult that was known to take out rather heinous political assassinations of their enemies. The cult became known as the Hashishiyya cult. The Hashishiyya name lends itself to two word origins, actually, in our language today, and that is the word assassin comes from Hashishiyya, as well as the word hashish, because this cult was known to use marijuana in some of its celebrations and rites, not during its assassinations, but just as a ceremonial ritual in the religious aspects of their lives. So, yeah, that's where the word hashish comes from, actually. As far as American use of marijuana goes, it was primarily used as an agricultural product, actually. Cannabis sativa was grown by General George Washington, in fact, in the Revolutionary days, and he had crops of hemp in his fields, and some of that hemp actually went into the creation of the first money. The first U.S. currency was printed on hemp paper made by the product Cannabis sativa. More recently, in the 20th century, there's been less interest in marijuana. There was not much reported use in the early 1900s at all. The people that were using marijuana at that time were typically jazz musicians, who are often black jazz musicians, associating marijuana with black culture, arts culture, and Mexicans. And there was a fair amount of growing and use of marijuana in Mexico, and that is very likely where the iteration of Mary Jane comes from. Marijuana, a Spanish translation of Mary Jane, of course. As a result of this association, once again, of a psychoactive drug with immigrant and black populations, we have states beginning to make marijuana illegal in the early part of the 1920s and 30s, as alcohol prohibition was also undertaken. And then by the late 1930s, we have all states having some kind of law regulating the use, sale, or possession of marijuana. In 1937, that's the first federal act, the Marijuana Tax Act, which makes marijuana in the same category essentially as opium and cocaine, dealt with in the 1914 Harrison Act, and that essentially restricted its use pretty significantly. Ooh, bumpy. Almost all of that early regulation had little bearing on the science and reality of the effects of marijuana on people, but rather had a lot to do with the social categories with whom it was associated. Those laws were just one corner of the triangle or pyramid of prejudice that often can lead to our common lay understanding of a drug being bad or harmful, when in fact it may have medicinal properties and the harms are exaggerated. The other two corners of that triangle or pyramid of prejudice are the media and the way the media treat drugs. Just watch the film Reefer Madness to see a real biased portrayal of marijuana from the 1930s. And then the third corner is the lack of scientific evidence addressed when Congress and the media pass laws or distribute information or misinformation about drugs. Of course, in the 1960s, marijuana was taken up in high regard by young people who were eager to do anything that pissed off their parents. They were fighting the establishment, they were fighting authority, and any figures that represented authority, parents, government, teachers, you name it, were people not to be trusted and to be fought against in every way possible. And one of the only means that young people have, because they're not rich generally, and they don't have institutional power generally, high positions in institutions to exert their will, young men started growing their hair long and growing beards and mustaches, which were not okay in the workplace. For example, in the 1960s, I remember my father started teaching high school in 1962 or 63, I think, and he was told to shave his beard. He was not allowed to wear a beard as a professional in the 1960s, the early 1960s. By the late 1960s, that all had changed, and largely it was young people who instituted those changes. Attitudes towards sex changed, attitudes toward music certainly changed, new forms of music, new experimentation, and attitudes towards drugs changed, of course, as well. Using drugs became a way of going against the establishment, countering the culture of drug prohibition that had existed since 1914, and was growing. And I believe when we looked in chapter 3 at the director of the IRS efforts to interdict with drugs, his name was Harry Anslinger, one of the first drug czars in the U.S. He was in place for 30 years, and almost into the 1960s. And he was very much responsible for creating the attitude of illegality and stigma against drugs. He was followed up by J. Edgar Hoover, the new director of the FBI in the 50s and 60s. And Hoover was very adamant to continue the mission to essentially, without these words, fight a war on drugs. So those efforts continued into the 60s, but were resisted more and more, again, by the counterculture, and drugs became a major element of that resistance, and particularly the psychoactive drugs, marijuana and LSD, on the part of the hippie generation. So that's what popularized marijuana, really, truly, in the 60s in America. And that's what led to the war on drugs, as we've seen, with Nixon declaring the war on drugs in order to subdue the hippies and the Black Panthers. And that led into the 1970s, a decade of questioning. The 1980s, a renewal of the conservative efforts to reestablish authority, reestablish, I guess, systems of hierarchy in America that the classic boomer generation was trying to de-establish. And then that's truly when the war on drugs ramps up and we start to see mass incarceration begin. And one of the most common offenses for putting somebody in jail and eventually potentially into prison were marijuana offenses, definitely. It was a common drug, still the most common federally illegal substance that people use and possess. And to make the possession and use a arrestable offense was the goal of the war on drugs, truly. That is turning around today, clearly. Half the states now legally recognizing the right to use or possess marijuana and grow it even in one's home recreationally. More than half, I think 38 states now, medically recognizing the use of marijuana. And so clearly the tide has turned. The war on drugs is not over, certainly. There's still problems of mass incarceration, and marijuana is still federally illegal, although it very recently has changed the schedule from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, recognizing the medical usefulness and potential scientific value of marijuana. So chemically, what is it doing to us? When you take cannabis into your bloodstream, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinols, as well as many other substances unique to the resin found in the flowering buds of the female plant. I didn't mention earlier, it's only the female plants that can produce the resin, not the male plants. The male plants could be grown exclusively in order to grow hemp, and you wouldn't have any psychoactive drug at all in that crop. But in any case, in the female plants, that THC is present, and that is just one of 85 different chemicals that are unique, again, to the cannabis plant. It's thought that many of these chemicals may have medical applications, if not psychoactive ones. It appears that only THC, the delta-9 and potentially the delta-8 form, are psychoactive. So, along with other neurotransmission systems being directly altered by THC, including serotonin and dopamine systems, the THC has another neurotransmitter in it called anandamide. And anandamide is thought to be an active agent of cannabis and its psychoactivity. Incidentally, this is a neurotransmitter also found in chocolate. Time to onset, of course, depends on the way in which it's administered, and time to onset for smoked marijuana is typically 20 to 30 seconds. It's almost immediate. Time to onset for eaten orally taken marijuana is longer, of course. It's probably 45 minutes to an hour. And common mistake people make is they don't feel it within half an hour and then they take more. And that we talked about when we covered Chapter 5, Modes of Administration. All right. After onset, the duration of effect is typically 1 to 2 hours for smoked marijuana, 2 to 4 hours, possibly 6 for edible marijuanas, depending on potency and dosage. And so it's a pretty considerable difference between the two forms of administration. It exits the body, as usual, through the urine and processed by the liver. The THC is actually not entirely removed from your system. THC has high lipid solubility, which means that it's stored in fats. And once it's stored away by your bloodstream into your fats, it's going to be there for a little while. So THC, unlike other drugs, is detectable up to 3 to 4 weeks after ingesting it, because it's being stored in your body in a way that other drugs aren't. So that's why you can have drug tests that show whether it's present in your system up to 3 or 4 weeks later. And there's really not much you can do about that. There's all sorts of products out there that people sell, or home remedies for passing the drug test at work. if you're a pot smoker in a state where it's illegal. And those are variable at best in terms of their success. And there are also specific cannabinoid receptors in your brain. Cannabinoids are endogenous. In other words, our body makes similar substances. And those receptors, there's at least CB1 and CB2 have been discovered. I think further receptors may have also been discovered that are responsible for the activity in the brain. CB1 receptors found primarily in the brain and are responsible again for the psychoactivity. CB2 receptors found in the peripheral nervous system. The acute effects on the body are to produce sympathomimetic responses, which again means that you're mimicking the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is the go and get 'em branch, the up and at 'em, the flight or flight, however you say it, branch of the autonomic nervous system, dilating the eyes, dilating blood vessels, increasing heart rate, getting the body ready for action. So that's the acute effect. There are other effects beyond the stimulation, of course. There's a relaxation effect, an effect on somehow both the digestive and cognitive functions in terms of what you find desirable to eat and what you find funny or cognitively stimulating, if you will. New forms and patterns of thought may emerge as a result of the drug. There's a dryness of the mouth as well, lack of salivation, and reddening of the eyes. That's just a symptom of the vasodilation or the widening of the blood vessels. No known overdoses have happened as a result of taking too much marijuana. It is not a drug that apparently you can overdose on, which makes it mysterious, again, why it's on Schedule 1, which are where you find the drugs which have a lack of accepted safety and overdose potential. So, there's that. Chronic physiological and behavioral effects of marijuana are honestly not well known because of the scientific ban on research in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. But it is known that there is no cardiovascular risk for healthy people. Of course, anybody who has issues with their heart may want to think twice about using any drug that increases heart rate, but no special or exceeding risk in young or healthy users of cardiovascular problems or damage. There are some reports of reproductive effects, slowing the sperm motility, it's called, in men. In other words, reducing the amount of flagellation that the tail does on the sperm, as well as lower sperm counts potentially in men. So that could be a concern for reproductive effects. As far as the immune system goes, some argue that it aids the immune system, others argue that it harms the immune system, but there's no consistent data on that. There is, however, there are, however, mortality studies that show that there's no correlation between long-time chronic marijuana use and higher morbidity rates or higher death rates. Cannabis has been part of American culture for a long time, but particularly noticeable since the 1960s, where there's been a large amount of reference to cannabis in popular literature and even cartoons and comics, and there's seemingly constant references in movies. There are dedicated magazines and journals to cannabis, among them High Times, a magazine that goes back to the 1960s, celebrating cannabis culture. Music has been indelibly shaped by marijuana, particularly the music of bands like the Grateful Dead or the entire jam band genre, where people are almost expected to take drugs at their concerts and festivals. There's certainly an effect on clothing, with the classic tie-dye t-shirt being representative of the colorful splash of vision that comes with hallucinogens and marijuana, and so forth. And it's no doubt that all of these have had an impact on the attitudes regarding cannabis, which have led to legalization in nearly half of the states, as well as other countries such as Canada and Mexico. And all of these impacts have no doubt led to the fact that marijuana is probably one of, if not the most important drug to recognize in terms of law and policy, as well as general cultural use today. It is far more widely used than opioids, even prescription opioids, and it has levels of use somewhere around 10% of American society, regular users. And that would be about 30 million people. So that number is probably only going to grow into the future, and thus, like with alcohol and tobacco, we need to make sure that harms that come from drug use are addressed both scientifically as well as culturally in a responsible way. So there you have it. That's our lecture on marijuana. Hopefully I made that brief, and we'll continue with the last chapter of High Price, Chapter 17, Drug Policy Based on Fact, Not Fiction. Thanks. See you later.
All right, welcome to the final edition of High Price by the Fireplace. This is Chapter 17 this week, Drug Policy Based on Fact, Not Fiction. And in this chapter, Hart is very earnestly trying to use all of his experiences as he's described throughout the book to reflect on how drug policy is made and the fact that often it is not made based on the science. It is made based on moral conviction, stereotype belief, and on sometimes simple discrimination and prejudice. So to get away from this pyramid of prejudice, he says we need to base our drug policy on science. We should base it on clear options that exist that often are misunderstood. And well, let's just get into 3 or 4 of those options. He says that oftentimes we simplistically think about drug policy as being either a choice between prohibition or legalization, and offers that there are many choices between those extremes, and that those choices sometimes would be better policy decisions than simply saying we should make a drug illegal or we should completely make it open to the free market. Some of those options might be decriminalization, where a drug is not made criminal in the sense that you wouldn't go to jail and do hard time for possession or selling of the drug, but it is not legal in the sense that it is open to marketing, and you could find say a dispensary for the drug anywhere. Somewhere in between there is a medium point where somebody might pay a fine, or there might be some sort of interdiction on the part of a social worker or a lawyer or a doctor, or all three, for those who are found to be possessing or using or selling drugs that are decriminalized, but that person would not have a criminal record, would not go to jail, and persistent use offenses might simply land somebody in rehab rather than in jail. This is kind of an experiment that's been done in Portugal, so read about the Portugal experiment and the outcome of that, which has not introduced greater rates of drug use and has limited the prison population in terms of drug possession. Another option might be purity testing, drug purity testing, which describes the experiment in Spain that's been done on that level. This was an experiment done by a non-governmental organization. It wasn't the Spanish government, but a non-governmental group called Energy Control, which oversaw the dispensation of drug purity tests at popular places where drugs are used, like music festivals and so forth. Drug purity testing has the advantage of making sure that the drug that you think it is what it is, and that say you have a bag of heroin and there's fentanyl lacing it, there's a lower chance of overdose if you're aware of what drugs you're taking into your body. So drug purity testing can reduce overdose deaths, which we know, of course, are off the charts in the modern era. Another option might be safe drug consumption sites. These are sites that have popped up in Switzerland over the years, and in America as well. Philadelphia has attempted a safe drug consumption site in recent years. This is where a user can go and get safer versions of drugs, like, for example, opioids. If somebody's hooked on heroin, they might be able to begin the journey of getting off of their dependency by going to a safe drug consumption site where there's a doctor and a social worker monitoring use, and they would also provide a safer version of heroin, such as methadone or Suboxone, which can help to reduce withdrawal symptoms and help somebody get off if they are trying their hardest to get off, but just need that fix to get to the next day. Those kinds of humanitarian options certainly exist outside of the realm of simply saying drugs need to be prohibited, made illegal, and those who possess them turned into criminals. And the simple option of legalization, whereby drugs aren't controlled necessarily. But even in legalization strategies, regulation is a clear form of control. With current legalized drugs like alcohol and tobacco, obviously they're regulated in terms of age and where they can be sold, when they can be sold, and so forth. So let's keep our minds open. Hart hopefully has made an impression upon you and has made true with the subtitle of his book and challenged everything you know about drugs and drug culture in modern America. So thanks for reading. Appreciate your participation. And this is the last video, so be well. Moving on with assignments this week. It's basically just keeping up with these last few assignments. You know what they are now: quiz, discussion, online media. The online media is an optional bonus one this week, as it was last week. And if you're writing a paper for SOCI 370, please get that in by May 10th. I'll be looking for that. Okay, I'm going to have feedback to you very soon on your rough drafts if I haven't seen that already. All right, be well. Take care. Thank you. Cheers.